When we talk about the Northern Renaissance painters, we're talking about artists who combine elements of quite complicated symbolism with very carefully observed studies of the natural world. Many of the paintings that we review in our text and in these lecture guides combine these two elements. These artists can make their paintings look very real in terms of detail, but overall, if you regard them closely, the space and the body don't always look what we could call entirely real. It's a very different kind of realism than we see in the Italian Renaissance. In the Italian Renaissance, linear perspective reigns. Realism is based on the use of science, anatomy, and math, consisting of both linear perspective and geometry. Side by side, we see very different ways of working with spatial distance and again, linear perspective. We're returning here to Jan van Eyck's second painting that we're studying, the double portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife that we looked at in video number 2. What ideas might you have about some of the details we talked about in this painting that might be representative of signs? The shoes on the floor, the mirror in the back, the actual tapestries on what may be the bridal chamber bed. Examining the way that the figures are depicted in these various symbols, what do you really think is the subject of this portrait? Again, an engagement or a wedding ceremony being celebrated, or commemoration as a memorial following the death of Arnolfini's wife. Note the details of the face of the sitter in Jan van Eyck's Man in a Red Turban alludes to the fact that this is a portrait that shows every crease in this sitter's face. Is it a flattering portrait? Is it a more truthful rendering? Things to consider. Was this common at the time, or were more flattering portraits generally the ones being painted? Especially considering that we regard this as a self-portrait. What does that say, perhaps, about the painter's feelings and ideas about his own mortality? Jan van Eyck's Man in a Red Turban is widely considered a self-portrait of the artist. One part of that, the evidence for that theory, is that he included what was known to be his personal motto at the top of the painting's panel. It's written in Greek, and it reads, "As I can, but not as I would." What do you think that means? And why might he have selected that line for his personal motto? The Merode altarpiece is an excellent example of the Flemish school and of the heavy religious symbolism that existed at this time in the mercantile Flemish world. Mercantile meaning trades or businessmen. There were donors in this fairly flush or well-to-do merchant business class who commissioned paintings like this. This was a new middle class of bankers and merchants commissioning works of art. They wanted the images that brought the divine into their own world. And we see another example of this in the Giovanni Arnolfini painting of Giovanni and his wife, we assume, the double portrait. Same kind of mercantile class donor or patron. As we see here too, there is an excellent example of a lack of linear perspective found in the Flemish School of Painting at this time. There's an emphasis on humanity overall, the bodies under their draped garments, rather than halos or sanctification of the individual or even of a holy person. So these artists in the Northern Renaissance at this time in the Flanders area, Flanders being Flemish, which is both Dutch and Belgium, and even at some point a part of France, made their paintings look very real in terms of detail, But again, as I've said before, the space and the body don't look entirely real. It's a very different kind of realism than we see in the Italian Renaissance. Looking at this remarkably detailed painting, in the center, we see the theme of the Annunciation. What is the biblical theme of the Annunciation? A very common subject in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, and afterwards. The angel Gabriel is announcing, hence the title, Annunciation, announce, to Mary that she is about to conceive the Christ child. The Holy Spirit, which impregnates Mary, is shown coming in through one of the windows on the right in the form of a small image of Christ carrying the cross on his back. The right-hand panel shows Joseph, Saint Joseph, Mary's husband, a carpenter by trade, and he's shown in his shop. This is really one of the amazing examples of characteristics of Northern Renaissance art, because every item that we see here and in the overall Maraude altar piece, even though they look like ordinary objects, are really religious symbols. The tools that Joseph is working with are a symbol of the Passion of Christ. The lilies symbolize Mary's virginity in the middle panel, and the candle that's just been extinguished tells us that this is a moment when God takes human form and his exclusively divine nature disappears. This material world is imbued with spiritual meaning, with the divine. It really is one of the defining characteristics of Northern Renaissance art. But it wasn't only in their paintings that the Flemish people, the people of Flanders, used everyday objects to symbolize spiritual ideas. It was part of their way of thinking. And this very much transfers too into the concept of still life, to the genre of still life Dutch paintings, of which you can see many marvelous classical examples, not just in the Amsterdam Rijksdalen Museum, but in many other major museums in the world. The Metropolitan New York, for example, is rich in Dutch masterpieces. When we look at the altarpiece overall, it would have been closed, and there are no outer paintings when it wasn't in use for Mass. This is a triptych in that it is composed of 3 parts. It's a picture, too, that, again, as it represents the Flemish school, stands as a milestone between 2 periods, summarizing the medieval tradition and laying the foundation for the development of modern painting. To look at the central panel again, this is one of the earliest representations of the Annunciation, shown in an ordinary Flemish interior, presenting this miraculous event in very everyday surroundings, which probably reminded the contemporaries of the patron who commissioned this painting of his own home. It's important to note that almost all the supernatural elements, such as halos, have been excluded, removed. So the sanctification is more of the everyday. Only the tiny infant with the cross, kind of surfing on these 7 golden rays, remains of this idea of holiness. Another thing to mention is that in the left wing of the triptych, the donors, who are presumably a married couple, they're kneeling, are in an enclosed garden, which is another symbol of Mary's virginity, before the open door of the house where the Annunciation is occurring. So this implies that the scene is a vision coming forth from their own faithful meditations. These kinds of presentations were very popular with the Flemish patrons commissioning these paintings, who wanted a religious work to appear in the same space and time as as what was found in their everyday homes and on the same scale. Look too at the donors' eyes. They seem oddly unfocused. They're directed inward, not outward, intent on the spiritual exercise of imagining their own presence, perhaps within this sacred narrative. Again, one of the hallmarks of the Northern Renaissance style was based on this very close observation of the world. And the figures sometimes seem almost too large for their rooms, for their space. This is an enlargement, a detail of Joseph in his shop, but we see even in the true to size scaled panel that he looks like he's crowding his space. And one of the wonderful little moments of making the sacred part of the everyday is that Joseph is making something very mundane. He's making a mousetrap, which is symbolic for the trap of the devil. So all these wonderful little clues and again meanings behind everyday objects exist in the mundane details of this painting. When we gaze out the windows that are in the panel with Joseph, we see the Flemish city behind him. And again, all these marvelous little details to which so much attention is given. The bolts in the wood, the hooks holding up the shutters, all these things become part of the idea of the sacred moment. The deposition was a very popular subject in the 15th century because of its capacity for grand-scale dramatic portrayals as a subject. Here, Roger sets the act of removing Jesus' body from the cross on the shallow stage of a box, like it's the case of a carved, big painted altarpiece. The 10 figures are three-dimensional and not renderings, but near life-size almost. And real to life human figures who press forward almost into our viewing space, really allowing no escape from their forceful expressions of grief. Jesus' friends almost seem with their portrait-like faces and their very scrupulously described contemporary dress like real people, like real friends mourning their closest friend. His corpse, Jesus' corpse, dominates the center of the composition. It kind of droops into this languid curve framed by his arms that are so thin and angular. And then that pose is somewhat echoed by the almost repetitive form of his mother, the Virgin, nearly fainting, as if mother and son are sharing in the same redemptive passion of Jesus' death and his sacrifice on the cross. So that it encourages viewers, especially of that time, to identify with them or their companions. They're all united in sorrow, these mourning figures. From the intensity of Mary Magdalene at the right, she's sort of wringing her hands together to John the Evangelist stare, again to Jesus' mother, the Virgin, collapsing. And we see in Roger's choice of color and pattern here how well he balances this composition. There's a complexity of the gold brocade. This is worn by Joseph, who offered, in fact, his new tomb for the burial, and the contorted pose and the very bright dress of Mary Magdalene. This contrasts with the visual impact of the right side of the panel, and it somewhat counters these larger figures we see on the left. The palette is subtle, slightly muted in colors elsewhere outside of these bright expanses, brilliant, of blue and red and these white accents that focus attention on the main subjects. Also look at the winding cloth that the tunic, the kind of tunic of the youth, the young man on the ladder, set against Jesus's body, which is so pale, in the way that that turban and shawl, that white turban and shawl, emphasize the ashen and gray face of Mary as they take her son down from the cross. The Roman Catholic Church of Saint-Maclou in Rouen, France, is one of the best examples of what is called the flamboyant style of Gothic architecture. This is the late Gothic period, which is the 15th to 16th century, moving into the Renaissance in the 16th century. There's also a video posted in your week one that shows you the grandeur and the phenomenal detail of this architectural structure. The Jacques Coeur house, Coeur means heart in French, is rather unusual and innovative for its time. It's outstanding because it's a precursor to the grand Renaissance period mansions that are starting to be built at the end of this period. It has a very impressive and massive Gallo-Roman wall against which the main building is constructed, and a number of architectural details and emblems that are representative of Jacques Coeur's The Architect's style. Woodcuts are also called woodblock printings. This is a very old art form. Probably the best known historic woodcut artist is Albrecht Dürer, spelled D-U-R-E-R, who was practicing in the 15th and 16th centuries in Germany. And we will study him, especially an outstanding self-portrait, subsequent to week 1. Woodcut also has a strong history in Eastern art. As I said, it's a very old art form, and we know that it was practiced as early as the 8th century in Japan. In a woodcut print, a piece of wood is cut along the grain. If you can visualize a plank of wood, like wooden flooring, the broad side of it is where the artist would carve to produce an image. And then when printed, the carved out areas stay white, and the area that's left, the remaining area, is the one that receives the ink. The German artist Martin Schongauer, as we see here, was an immensely skilled engraver, but he was also a consummate printmaker, excelled in drawing, and was very, very skilled at this difficult technique of shading from deep blacks to faint grays, using only these lines. In the Temptations of St. Anthony, he's illustrating the original biblical meaning of temptation as a physical assault. This is a 1470s engraving, and in these grotesque demons we see swarming around St. Anthony, the curves of their positioning look like they're almost bursting with movement and energy, and St. Anthony just floats as if he's on some sort of a meditative cushion in the middle of them, very calmly resisting their temptations. He's shown with some of his signature attributes, dressed in a monk's religious habit and cowl. He's carrying a staff with a little shaped handle, and he's got a girdled book hanging from his belt. The literary source from which this image derives is debated. It could depict chapter 65 from the life of St. Anthony, written by Athanasius, where the hermit has a vision of himself floating through the air and undefined beings prevent him from ascending back to reality. Or it could be in the 9th chapter of the same book, where St. Anthony is attacked by the devil in the form of animals and beasts in the Egyptian desert. And he's levitated into the air by the practice of his very rigorous asceticism. He's an ascetic. He eschews all pleasures in life. What we see here on a technical level that's so masterful is the way Schongauer is very systematically breaking up the image into lines and dots and areas of hatching. He's varying the spaces between those practices in order to enhance the interaction of white and black. The engraving itself exists in 2 states, with only minor details added to the second, meaning there's only 2. You can see these very fine paralleled cross-hatchings in the hermit's drapery, in St. Anthony's drapery, and in the texture of the devils as they're drawn. You can also see it in the battered crags in the right-hand corner. And there's a tick hatching seen in the sky that indicates atmosphere. The other thing to note is this vast amount of negative space in the background that accentuates St. Anthony's vulnerability, while curving the horizontal lines of the devils adds to them that energy and movement. And these grotesque devils, if you look closely, are illustrated with a mixture of body parts from different animals. So they're somewhat gruesome and grotesque and fanciful. Overall, Schongauer's mastery of texture is by giving each person who views this work a sense of how each beast would feel, ranging from the roughness of the scales to the soft hairiness, the furriness. And that very heavily worked background is balanced by progressively more isolated lines in the background, showing Schongauer's incredible mastery and control of light